In this video, I'm going to show you how to make your own bias tape. You can buy pre-made bias tape in the store, but it usually has a very limited selection of color and pattern. So by making it yourself, you can pick whatever fabric you want and then make your projects more unique. Bias tape is great for edging projects like pot holders or purses or whatever you want. So basically what a bias tape is, it's a long strip of fabric that have been stitched together by smaller strips of fabric. And then what you do is you fold in the edges. I'm just going to fold this out so these edges are folded in, and then it's been folded again down the middle. So I'm going to show you how to make the double folded bias tape by using a bias tape maker that you can get in the craft store. So let's get started. To make your own bias tape, you're going to need the following items. You're going to need some fabric, and it just depends on how much tape that you need to make, but this one is about 16 by 22 inches, so it's just short of a fat quarter. And then I'm going to do it using my rotary cutter. So I need my mat, my rotary cutter, my plastic ruler. I also like my sewing gauge, some sort of fabric marker. So I'm just going to use chalk for this fabric since it's a little dark. And then you're also going to need your bias tape maker. So this is one I bought at the fabric store. And you're going to notice on the back of the package, it's going to tell you what size bias tape it makes and also what size strips you need to make. This is a 1-inch bias tape maker, and I'm going to be doing a double fold bias tape. And it wants me to cut out my strip 2 inches wide. So that's what I'm going to do for this one. But you're going to want to consult the back of your package to know how wide you need to make your strips. So now we're going to be making our strips. So I have my fabric laid out here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take one corner and I'm going to fold it until I reach the other side of my fabric here. Because we're going to be cutting our strips on the bias of the fabric. So they're not going to be going up and down or horizontally here. They're going to be going at a diagonal. And why we do this is because this will make our bias tape have a little bit of stretch if you cut it on the bias. And that's why it's called bias tape. It's also really good for if you're going around curves or well, basically that's what it's for going around curves. So the first thing I'm going to do is, now that I have this folded, I need 2-inch strips. I'm going to take my sewing gauge here and mark it to the 2-inch mark. And then all I'm going to do is going to mark my fabric at that 2-inch mark. And you don't need to have a rotary cutter. You can just do this with scissors, but it just takes a little bit longer. It's definitely faster if you use a rotary cutter. So I'm just going to mark right along here. And once I have a few marks that I can see, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my plastic ruler here and I'm going to line it up with my marks. Okay. And then I'm just going to cut it with my rotary cutter. Then I'm going to continue doing this until I run out of fabric here. So I'm just going to move this down since it's a little bit longer than my ruler. Okay. And then once I have that cut, then from this cut line, I'm going to measure another 2 inches, and I'm just going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and finish doing this, and then we're going to move on to our next step. After you cut out your strips, you're going to want to square the ends of each of your strip on both ends. So you see how I have my point here? So I'm just going to cut off the end of my point, again with my rotary cutter. And I'm going to do that for each of my strips. So there's a lot of cutting that you need to do when making your own bias tape. But that's why it's a lot easier if you have a rotary cutter. It makes the work go by a lot faster than if you were doing scissors. And it's easier to make sure that it's straight. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this. And then what we're going to do is start sewing our strips together. So now I want to attach all our strips together into one long piece. So to do that, you're going to take one of your strips with a square edge, and you're going to take another strip and you're going to put it so it's perpendicular to each other. So each strip is going to go at a 90-degree angle. I'm going to put a pin here. And what we're going to do is we're going to stitch diagonally here at the end. So from one corner to the other corner. So once I have that one, I'm now going to take this end of my strip and do another one, and again putting it perpendicular. So I'm going to do this with all my strips, and then we're going to go over to the machine and we're going to stitch them diagonally. So now I'm going to sew my strips together diagonally from this corner to this corner, and I just drew a little chalk line to use as a guide because I'm awful at just eyeballing things and hoping that they come out straight. So I'm just doing a regular stitch with back stitches on each end, and I'm just going to follow my guide. Let me get this pin out of the way, and I'm going to do this to the ends of each strip until I get to the end. So there's one. Alright, so that one's done. So now I'm going to move on to my next one, and I'm just going to go ahead and finish doing each one of these. At this point, you should have one long strip of fabric here. So here I have my seam, and I forgot to mention that when you're pinning and sewing these, you want to make sure that you put right sides together like you would any other type of fabric pinning. Now mine is kind of hard to tell because it looks the same on both sides, but I will just want to make sure then that I'm doing it the same way. So here's my seam, and you see my excess fabric on the back. When I get to my next strip, here's my seam with my fabric that's hanging off here in the back. So it's the same way. So if I lay this out, on one side you're going to see the seam here, and then if I were to flip it over, you were to see the excess fabric right here. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut off these points. So from my stitch line, it's only going to be about 1/4 of an inch. This is so when we press this out, we're not going to see a bunch of fabric hanging on the back. We just want a little tiny seam here. So I'm just going to take my ruler again, and I'm just going to trim it with my rotary cutter. So I'm going to do this for each of my seams. See how that's small now? And then we're going to take this to our iron, which is probably the most important component of making bias tape, because we need to get our iron in order to press our creases. And we're just going to press our seam allowance so this lays nice and flat. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off all my points here, and then I'm going to take this to my iron board. So here I have my strip, and you'll see my excess fabric where the seams are faced up, and I'm just going to press these seams open. And just make sure that my strip here doesn't have any major wrinkles going on. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish pressing all these seams open, and then we're going to use our bias tape maker to go ahead and start making our bias tape. And you're going to want to keep your iron and your ironing board, because that is going to be essential in creating our bias tape. So we're going to start folding our bias tape strip, and you're going to want to make sure that the right side of the bias strip is facing down towards the ironing board, so the wrong side is facing up towards you. Here are some store-bought bias tape here, and I'm just going to fold it, and you'll see that it's pretty similar to what I have. We're going to use the bias tape maker in order to make these first set of outside folds here. So it's going to look like that when we get done with the end. So I'm just going to move that. Here's the bias tape maker. Now the flat side of the bias tape is going to be face down on the ironing board. The widest side is going to be towards the fabric, and this part is where the fabric is going to come out of. So in order to use it, you're going to take your one end of your strip and you're going to put it into the widest, and you'll notice that it's going to curve up to the sides here, which is exactly what it's supposed to do, because it's going to help it fold onto itself. So it's a little tricky just kind of pushing it in there, and you want to try to get it in as even as possible. So you'll see how it comes out and it's kind of slightly folded. That's exactly what you want. So when you get to this point, you're going to pin it, and then you have this little handle here, and you just kind of slowly pull it and it'll keep folding. So I'm going to show you how we finish doing this, because I'm going to get my iron and I'm going to go ahead and pin this in here, and then we're going to give you a better look at doing this final process. You're going to want to make sure that your iron is at a pretty hot setting. So I went ahead and I pinned the ends of my bias tape here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this, and you're going to want to keep your iron pretty close to the edge of your bias maker here. And I'm just going to carefully iron as I'm pulling my bias tape maker. And you're going to want to, again, keep this as straight as possible and not move it all to one side, because we don't want our folds to be completely uneven. So that's basically how simple it is to use a bias tape maker. So I'm just going to do this for the whole length of my strip. And if you find that you came across a part that didn't fold very neatly, just bring it forward and then carefully bring it back again. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and then in order to make a double fold bias tape, all I'm going to do is just fold this in half like that. But I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and then I'll show you me doing that. I finished folding and pressing my first set of folds. So now to make a double fold, I'm just going to fold this in half. And again, I'm going to stick a pin down here to hold it while I iron it, like that. Get my iron here. And then very carefully, I'm going to iron this whole thing in half without burning my fingers. And then once you're done with your ironing and your folding, you will have homemade double folded bias tape to use for whatever project you need. Here I have my completed bias tape, and I'll just open it up here. So you see I have my two sides folded in, and then it folded in half. So now it's a double folded bias tape, and it's great for trimming your projects. And now that you can make your own, you can use any type of fabric you want and any type of color combination you want on your projects. So it's just a great addition to have in order to make your projects more unique.